The plastic bracelet hit the marble floor before anyone understood what it was. It was pink, gone yellow at the edges, the kind a hospital snaps onto a newborn's wrist, and it bounced once and slid to a stop against the shoe of a man who'd just stepped out of the private elevator. Nobody in the lobby of Votava Freight moved. 10 seconds earlier, Sloane Hartigan had been holding a sandwich bag sealed with packing tape, the kind a person carries when they've learned that paper doesn't survive weather. And she'd unzipped it with 2 manicured fingers, pulled out the letter inside, torn it in half, and dropped both pieces into her coffee cup without raising her voice once. That was the part people would remember later, not the shouting. There wasn't any. Just a woman in a cream suit disposing of another woman's words the way you'd throw out a receipt. The woman that letter belonged to was 27 years old, and she stood between 2 security officers in a surplus army coat and men's boots a size too big, melted snow running off her in a V-shaped stain across the Carrara stone. Her name was Maeve Sullivan. 4 years ago, she'd been a hematology technician at a hospital 14 blocks north, with a badge and a paycheck and a license. Now she carried her life in a knotted trash bag, and inside that bag, wrapped in 3 layers of plastic, were a stack of postal receipts she'd stopped numbering a long time ago, a birth certificate with the father's line left blank, and a notebook with a blue cover she'd kept since the day the world taught her that the only thing nobody can take out of your pocket is what you wrote down. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She said, "Give it back." She wrote that with her left hand because her right one doesn't hold a pen anymore. "It isn't yours." August Votava was 34, and he ran a check operation his grandfather started at the Chicago docks, which meant he'd spent 10 years learning the difference between something staged and something lived through. He bent down and picked the bracelet up. Faded print along the band, Baby Girl Sullivan, and a weight, and a date in June of 2019. He turned it over, and there, on the inside of the clasp, were 2 small tooth marks where a child had chewed the plastic soft. You can print a photograph, you can buy a bracelet, you can't fake a kid gnawing on her own hospital band until it wears down. He didn't believe the letter yet. He didn't believe anything yet. But he'd built a life on reading evidence, and those 2 marks were evidence. He looked up, and the whole room heard it. "Take your hands off her." Sloane's smile went somewhere and didn't come back. What Maeve had carried through 4 bus transfers and 3 hours of March slush wasn't a demand for money. It was a request for a signature, because the child in that letter had been buried in Section 14 of a county cemetery, in a grave with 11 strangers and no stone. And Illinois won't let a mother move her own daughter without a legally established father's name on the paperwork. And the woman who'd just torn that letter into a coffee cup had spent 4 years making certain that name never appeared, because the moment it did, she'd stop being the most important person in August Votava's life. Before the sun went down, 1 intercepted letter, 1 bought laboratory, and 17 minutes of missing security footage would take apart everything she'd built. If this story moves you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now let's go back to that lobby, and to the 2 tooth marks that started all of it. The first man let go before the other, and his hand flew from Maeve's wrist, so quickly it looked as though her skin had suddenly turned hot. The second man was a beat slower, long enough for the name badge on his chest to swing toward the light, Dov Kessler, and long enough for him to see who had spoken those words. The blood drained from his face in a way a grown man rarely allowed anyone else to witness. He stepped back half a pace, both hands held open at his sides, as though proving they had never touched anyone. Maeve drew both wrists against her chest and kept them there. Red marks were rising on her skin, each finger clearly outlined, but she didn't rub them. She stood with her back straight in a lobby, where everyone around her earned more money than she had made in her entire life, and she didn't rub her wrists, because rubbing them would mean admitting they hurt, and she had learned long ago that admitting pain gave other people one more thing to place a price on. Gus held out his hand. The letter. Sloane didn't move. She was still holding the paper cup, and the 2 halves of the letter lay inside it, slowly drinking in the brown liquid. "August, this isn't worth your, Sloane." He only said her name, once. He didn't raise his voice. In 10 years of working beside this man, she had learned that this was the most dangerous volume he possessed, and she held out the cup. He didn't take it. He reached in with 2 fingers, pinched the edges of the paper, and drew both halves out, letting them drip onto the stone floor. Then he walked to the reception desk, pushed the visitor register aside, and laid the 2 pieces across the wooden surface. He turned them. With the tip of his index finger, he eased one torn edge against the other, slowly and patiently, like a man piecing together a map. The entire lobby watched him do it. No one coughed. No one touched a phone. At the edge of the crowd, a woman with cropped hair and a gray sweater opened a small notebook and wrote the exact time of that morning in the margin of the page. Her name was Petra Nowak, and her job was to count the things no one wanted counted. She said nothing. She only wrote. Gus glanced up from the letter for a second. "You're bleeding." Maeve looked down. A thin scratch ran along the back of her hand where the clasp of the bag had scraped her when she tried to hold on to it. "It's nothing," she said. No wound becomes nothing simply because the person who caused it is rich enough to say so. Then he lowered his eyes and read. The ink had bled in several places, but the handwriting was still legible, slanted and firm, the kind of script written by someone taught in an age when penmanship was still a subject in school. "Mr. Votava, my name is Adeline Brewer. I worked as a midwife for nearly my entire life. One June morning, I delivered a baby girl in the bathroom of the Mercy Row shelter because the ambulance was stuck somewhere out on the road, and a child never waits for anyone. Her mother was Maeve Sullivan. Her father was you." He read that line, and nothing on his face changed, but Petra, standing only a few steps away, saw the muscle along the left side of his jaw tighten once and then release. The little girl had 2 cowlicks on the crown of her head. "I delivered enough babies to know that was rare. You have 2 as well. I saw them in a photograph in the newspaper. I'm not offering that as proof. It isn't proof. I'm offering it so you'll understand why an old woman who is running out of time would sit down and write this letter." The little girl's name was Junie. She loved the music from ice cream trucks, and she hated the color yellow because she said yellow was too loud. She died on August 19th, 2023. The city buried her in Section 14, a common grave. No marker. I'm not asking you for money. I'm dying, and your money can't buy what I need. Illinois won't allow a mother to move her child if the paperwork doesn't name an established father. That line was left blank because Maeve refused to write down the name of a man who had never said yes. Take a test. Hire an investigator. Doubt me down to the bone. I ask only one thing. Don't humiliate the little girl before you verify the truth. O. Brewer. Beneath the signature, in different ink and with a far shakier hand, as though it had been written on another day by a hand that had weakened in the time between those 2 days, were the words, "The little girl is lying beside 11 strangers. I only need your signature to bring her somewhere that bears her name." He read the final line. Then he read it again. Sloane stepped beside him, and her voice was very calm, almost gentle, the voice of someone rescuing another person from himself. "Are you really going to let a homeless woman stage a scene in our lobby?" "I'm going to let her finish speaking once," Gus said. "Those are 2 different things." And then, without thinking, without realizing what he was doing, he lifted a hand toward the crown of his head. He stopped halfway. His hand hovered there for a moment, then fell to his side. No one in the lobby saw it. No one except the woman in the gray sweater, who wrote that down too. The 9th floor conference room had a walnut table so long that even with 4 people seated around it, the room still felt empty. And on that table sat a tray of coffee that had been brought in before anyone had even thought to ask for it. The assistant poured a cup and pushed it toward Maeve. Maeve shook her head. She didn't explain. Petra Nowak took a bottle of water from the built-in refrigerator, twisted the cap until the plastic seal cracked loudly right in front of her, then set the bottle down. Only then did Maeve reach for it. Petra made no comment about that. She only wrote it in the margin of the page. Before sitting, Maeve looked down at the leather chair, then at her trousers, the fabric having soaked up all the melted snow from the street and now wet from the knees down. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the chair, so softly the words were almost soundless, and lowered herself onto the very edge of the seat. No one laughed. The whole room heard her, and not one person laughed, and that was the worst thing about the entire morning. Worse even than the red marks on her wrists, because laughter, at least, would have been a response. She placed the black garbage bag on the walnut table, and the rustle of plastic against the polished surface sounded like a noise from another world that had wandered into the wrong place. She untied the knot. There was no garbage inside. There were files wrapped in 3 layers of plastic, each layer folded over and sealed with clear tape, and as she took them out and arranged them on the table, she placed them in chronological order, the oldest on the left, the newest on the right, with the same amount of space between every stack. Petra watched those 2 hands work and understood something before anyone else in the room did. That wasn't the way a desperate person organized papers. That was the way someone organized papers when she had once been paid to do it. Petra wrote that down too. The first file contained a birth certificate, yellowed at the corners and sealed inside a thin plastic sleeve. Mother's name, Maeve Sullivan. Weight, date, the place of birth written in by hand, an address in Pilsen, and the space reserved for the father's name left blank, a strip of white as long as an entire human life. Gus looked at that blank space longer than he needed to. Then Maeve took the last thing from the bag, and it wasn't a file. It was a soft-covered notebook, all 4 corners curled, so thick it had to be held shut with a stretched-out rubber band, its cover torn loose and taped back along the spine. "What is this?" Gus asked. "It's her," Maeve said. He picked it up. The rubber band slipped free. He opened it at random somewhere in the middle, and the handwriting appeared before him. Small and crowded, written in different kinds of ink depending on which pen still worked that day. "She calls the stethoscope the cold ear. The doctor laughed through the whole appointment, and afterward he said he was going to call it that from now on, too." He turned a page. "She isn't allowed to run. So when the other children run across the yard, she sits on the steps and waves both arms as fast as she can. She says that's running with her hands. She says she's the fastest, and none of them argue, because when you look at her, she really does seem fast." He turned another page. "Today she bragged to the little girl next door that nearly 20 people live in my house together. Very fancy. The other girl went quiet for a moment, then said only 4 people live in my house." Junie comforted her. Gus read that line and set the notebook on the table. He said nothing for so long that Sloane looked at him twice. Then he picked it up again and began from the front, turning the pages more slowly, until he stopped at one whose upper corner had been folded into a small triangle, the only marked page in the entire notebook. He slipped his thumb beneath the fold to open it. "That page isn't for you," Maeve said. She didn't look up. She was straightening a stack of files that was already perfectly aligned. His hand stopped. With his thumb, he carefully smoothed the fold flat again, as though afraid he might tear it, then turned to another page. From the far end of the table, Sloane released a short breath through her nose. "Anyone can write a notebook," she said. Maeve didn't lift her head. She kept looking down at the papers in front of her. "Yes, Mom," she said. "Anyone. For 4 years, every day. Even on the days when there was nothing to write except the word okay." Sloane didn't answer in that room. Among people accustomed to hearing her produce an answer for everything, she didn't answer. She only smoothed the sleeve of her blouse once, very neatly. It was the first round she had lost in years. She remembered it, in her own way, and her way didn't require a notebook. Maeve pulled the file on the far left toward her and opened the first layer of plastic, then the second, then the third. Inside were faded photocopies, each one accompanied by a postal receipt fastened at the corner with a rusted paper clip. "The first batch was from the summer she was born," she said, pushing the top page across the table. Gus didn't pick it up. He only leaned down and read. "I don't need your money. I need to know whether anyone in your family was ever born with a heart condition. The doctor asked me, and I didn't have an answer. That is all I am asking." He read the line, and for one beat, he didn't breathe. Petra saw it. Petra saw everything. She wrote in the margin, not what the letter said, only that a breath had been missed, because people could argue later about words, but no one could argue about how long a man had stopped breathing. "The second batch covers the 2 years in between," Maeve said, sliding a thicker stack toward him. There was nothing dramatic in those letters. That was the worst part. The same question, written again once every year, and each time it was shorter than the one before, as though someone were slowly learning that words cost money too. The first letter in that batch was half a page long. The final one was 3 lines. Gus turned through them, and he realized that a person's despair could be measured by the average length of her sentences. "You didn't number them," Petra said. "I did at first," Maeve replied. "Then I stopped. Numbering them made it feel as though I was counting down to something." At the other end of the table, Sloane said nothing. She was staring at the stack of papers as though it were something that had just been dug up from beneath the floor of her own house. Then Maeve touched the final file, the one on the far right, and stopped. Her hand rested on the plastic and remained still longer than anything else she had done since the morning began. She didn't open it to read. She drew out the page inside without looking at it and pushed it across the walnut surface toward Gus. It contained only one sentence. He read it silently. He said nothing. He remained silent so long that the assistant standing in the corner had to lower her eyes to her feet, and Petra stopped writing, and Sloane, for the first time, couldn't find a sentence to force into the silence. Gus set the page down. He folded it in half along the old crease, and he folded it with great care, and no one in the room understood why he was being so careful with a piece of paper. Then Maeve took out the last item, the only one she hadn't written herself. It was a sheet of Votava freight letterhead, thick and textured, bearing the embossed logo he had paid a New York design firm to create. Miss Sullivan. Mr. Votava has no children. All further communication will be forwarded to legal counsel. His name appeared beneath it. I didn't write this, Gus said. Anyone can print letterhead, Sloane said. Her voice was still normal. There is an internal printer code in the lower corner, Maeve said. She still didn't look up. I used to work in a hospital, sir. Printers always identify themselves. They don't know how to lie. They have no motive. Then Petra spoke for the first time that morning, and she spoke in the voice of someone reading the weather. The date on this letter. She turned backward several pages in her notebook. Then she flipped one more. She stopped. You weren't in the country that day. You were in Prague. That flight was too long for you to have signed anything on the 11th floor. The temperature in the room changed. Not metaphorically. All four people felt it at once. The sensation of the air drawing back from their skin. Sloane lifted a hand to the strand of pearls around her neck and touched it. Only once, for a single second. Then her hand returned to the table and rested there perfectly flat. No one noticed. Maeve noticed. She drew the blue-covered notebook from inside her coat, opened it, and wrote. She said nothing at all. Petra was still turning through the incoming mail register. Her finger moved down one column, then stopped halfway. There was one final letter, she said. After Miss Sullivan's, Maeve looked up. For the first time that morning, her face did something she hadn't given it permission to do. Who sent it? Gus asked. No name was recorded, Petra said. Only the date. She read the date aloud. It was an autumn day, and it came after August 19th, 2023.
Where is it?
Gus asked. Petra turned the page. She looked down at the words in the final column, the column reserved for destination, and read them exactly as written, adding nothing. The register says, forwarded to the 11th floor. The 11th floor was where Sloane Hartigan worked, and on the 11th floor, anything sent there without a specific recipient always ended up in the same place, and that place had a paper shredder. Petra closed the incoming mail register and placed both hands on its cover, as though afraid it might fly away. If we do the test, she said, it has to go through a laboratory recognized by the court, a complete chain of custody, photographs of every seal at every stage, signatures across the evidence tape. Sloane nodded slowly, the kind of nod a person gave just before saying the opposite. I know a discreet place, Meridian Genomics. They work for families who don't want their names appearing anywhere. No leaks, no blogs, no one downstairs selling information to the tabloids for a few $100s. A person with an interest in the result can't choose the laboratory, Petra said. She didn't look at Sloane as she spoke. She looked at the center of the table. That isn't my opinion. It is a condition required for the result to have legal value. Discretion isn't interference, Petra. No. Petra raised her eyes. But chain of custody isn't a personal preference either. Gus didn't take part in the exchange. He was looking at the birth certificate, specifically at the line listing the place of birth, the Pilsen address written in the slanted handwriting he now recognized. What is this? He asked. This isn't a hospital, no, Maeve said. She wasn't born in a hospital. She was born in the bathroom of a shelter. The room fell silent in a different way. Then what is there to test? Gus asked. And that was when Maeve Sullivan lifted her head and looked directly at him for the first time since entering the room, and her voice changed. It didn't grow softer. It simply became precise, with the precision of someone reciting a procedure she had once known by heart. Illinois performs a heel prick on every child born in the state, she said. A few drops of blood absorbed onto a paper card. Newborn screening. The Department of Public Health keeps them. The child wasn't born in a hospital, Sloane said. Miss Audie still collected the sample. Maeve continued, looking at Gus. She was a certified midwife. She pricked the baby's heel within the required time, filled out the form, and put it in the mailbox with her own hands. For a child born in the bathroom of a shelter, when no one in this world required her to do any of it, Petra stopped writing. In more than 2 decades of practice, among all the children she had delivered in rooms that appeared in no official record, Adeline Brewer's final professional act had been to complete a form for a baby whose existence the world had not yet had time to acknowledge. She did it because that was how she did everything. And 4 years later, that form was the only thing on Earth capable of proving that the little girl had ever been here. "What about the state sample?" Petra asked. "If the Department of Public Health has it, how do we obtain it?" Maeve took a phone with a cracked screen from her coat pocket, dialed a number, and placed it in the middle of the table. It rang twice. "Rangel, Mr. Rangel, you're on speakerphone. Someone here wants to ask you a question about a newborn screening card." Behind the man's voice came the sound of a photocopier running. "You need a court order," Toby said. "The Department of Public Health doesn't release a newborn screening card for a civil matter simply because someone asks politely. It is a state medical record, and it is protected accordingly. 6 to 8 weeks at the earliest. And that is only if the judge is in a good mood." Petra wrote that number down. Sloane wrote nothing. She only turned very slightly in her chair toward Gus. "Are you really going to wait 8 weeks, August?" And that was all that happened. There was no conspiracy in the question. There was nothing anyone could later point to and say, "There, that was the moment." It was only a question asked in an ordinary voice, in a room where the heating system hummed quietly, on a March afternoon. He didn't wait. That was the first mistake. He chose Meridian. That was the second. He made both mistakes in the same afternoon, and neither of them came from stupidity. They came from something far worse. Federal agencies had been watching him for 8 years, and they wanted very badly to know what August Votava had worth hiding. And if a child born outside marriage appeared in a court record, it would become a thread they would pull until something broke. He had spent 10 years building a system in which no shipment crossed the harbor without 3 signatures from 3 people who weren't permitted to have dinner together. He had fired loyal men because they had signed for one another once. He had taught an entire organization that convenience was the most expensive thing a person could ever buy. Then the most important thing in his life appeared on a walnut table inside a knotted garbage bag, and he handed it to the only person he had never once, in all those 10 years, considered auditing. The building was empty by the time Sloane knocked on his office door, and she didn't wait for him to answer. She walked in with a thin file tucked beneath her arm and placed it on his desk, not sliding it toward him, simply setting it down, then stepped back and left it lying there. "Do you want to know who she really is?" she asked. "Not her version. The licensing board's version." He didn't touch it for a long while. Beyond the window, the city was lighting up in patches, and somewhere down there, a woman was walking south with a knotted garbage bag. At last he opened the file. The first page was a notice of termination from St. Bridget Hospital, printed on official letterhead, stamped, and dated. Employee name, Maeve Sullivan. Position, hematology technician. Reason for termination, typed neatly inside a small box as though it were a note about inventory supplies. Falsification of laboratory records. The second page was a ruling from the state licensing board. Professional certification. Revoked. No appeal recorded. The third, fourth, and fifth pages were 3 incident reports from the Chicago Police Department, filed on 3 separate occasions months apart, each one listing the same address, the very building where he was sitting now, and each one listing the same name. No arrests, only removal from the premises, 3 times. "She came here," he said. "3 times, Sloane said. "You can verify it yourself with security. I hope you do." She stood beside the window with both hands clasped behind her back, and she didn't raise her voice once. "August, the woman who brought a test result to your home and asked you to order another test is the same woman who was fired for falsifying test results. I didn't invent that. I didn't add a single word. I'm only putting it in front of you, and that was true. Every word in that file was true. The small box stating the reason for termination was true, because that was exactly what the hospital had written. The revocation order was true, because the board had indeed revoked her certification. The 3 police reports were true, because she had come 3 times and had been removed 3 times. There wasn't a single lie in that room. There was only an absence shaped precisely like everything that had been left out, and Sloane Hartigan had spent nearly 20 years learning that an absence placed in exactly the right spot worked better than any lie. Because a lie could be caught, but an absence couldn't. An absence was simply nothing there at all. Gus turned to the final page. At the bottom of the termination notice, beside the typed title Director of Laboratory Quality Assurance, there was a signature. It slanted to the right, the first 2 letters larger than the rest, the kind of signature made by someone who enjoyed the sight of their own name. He looked at it for perhaps 2 seconds. The name meant nothing to him. He didn't know that person. He had never shared a meal with them, never signed anything with them, never heard anyone mention them in any room where he had ever sat. He closed the file. He would remember the name later, but it would take time, and by then it would be too late to remember it cheaply. By then, it would cost him something he had no way to buy back. Sloane walked toward the door. She stopped with one hand on the handle, and she didn't turn all the way around, only enough for him to see half of her face. "You don't need to be cruel to her, August," she said. "I don't want you to be cruel to anyone. You simply need to stop being naive." Then the door closed, and he sat alone with the file beneath his hand. For nearly 10 years, that woman's certainty had been the roof over his head. When his father died, and 3 branches of the organization wanted to tear him into 3 pieces, she was the one who sat beside him for 11 hours, in a windowless room, and allowed no one to cross the threshold. When the grand jury called his name for the first time, she was the one who knew exactly which sentence he was allowed to say, and which one would bury him. She had never been wrong. That was what he told himself, and it was almost true. And almost true was the most dangerous thing of all. That night her certainty was still the roof above him. He sat beneath it in the glow of his desk lamp, with the file open before him, and a letter folded in half inside the right-hand drawer. That was the real problem. The car stopped some distance from the entrance to the Mercy Row shelter, and Gus remained sitting inside it for a while longer. Then he took off his coat, folded it, and left it on the back seat. Not because the weather was warm. It wasn't warm. He did it because he had stood in enough rooms in his life to know that walking into a place like that, wearing a coat worth more than an entire year of rent for the people sleeping there, wasn't courtesy. It was an act of violence, only one that left no mark on anyone's skin. Inside, the air smelled of industrial soap and the dampness of clothes hung up to dry. A row of bunk beds ran along the long wall. At the far end of the room, a small woman was folding blankets. She worked very slowly, and she couldn't stand straight, her back leaning to one side as though someone were pulling at her, but she still folded every blanket into a perfect square and stacked them into a column as straight as a ruler. She looked up when he entered. She wasn't surprised. "You're August Votava. Yes, you're taller than I expected." She set the blanket down. People are always taller than I expect when they arrive late. He had no answer for that. So he said what he had prepared in the car, the thing that had worked for 20 years. He said he would pay for everything, that there was a center on the north side of the city, that he could arrange it that very afternoon. Adeline Brewer listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt him once. Then she said, "I'm at the stage where money can't buy me another day, sweetheart. It can only buy me a nicer room to sit in while I wait. If you want to spend your money, spend it at the clinic down the street. Their waiting list is longer than my arm." A man sat in the corner of the room with a briefcase resting on his knees, salt and pepper hair, and reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. He didn't stand. "Mr. Votava," he said, "I'm Reeve Mastrantonio. I oversee Mrs. Brewer's palliative care. Talk to her," Gus said. "Tell her she's refusing something other people wait years to receive. I won't tell her that." Reeve removed his glasses. "Your money can remove barriers. It can't replace consent. This is Mrs. Brewer's body. She decides. Not you, not me. I only want to help. Everyone wants to help." Reeve didn't say it harshly, and that was why the words remained. The trouble is that most people want to help in whatever way makes it easier for them to breathe. Gus stood there in the middle of a room with 19 beds, and no one in that room felt the need to make space for him. He turned back toward Audie. "Why didn't you write sooner?" he asked. "If you knew from the beginning, if you delivered that baby, why did you wait until now?" She picked up the blanket and began folding it again from the start. "Why would I write to you?" she said. "You have someone who reads your letters for you." He didn't move. Somewhere behind him, a door opened and closed, and water began running into a sink. Audie finished folding the blanket, placed it on the stack, and smoothed the upper edge with her palm. Then she tipped her chin toward the far end of the room. Maeve was walking along the row of beds there, handing blankets to the people who had just come in. She gave each one with both hands. She said something to a man sitting on the edge of a bed, and he nodded, and she moved on. She didn't look toward the entrance even once. She didn't know he was standing there. "Look at that girl," Audie said. "She didn't come here for your money. If she wanted your money, she had far easier ways to get it than taking 4 buses through the snow, just to have 2 men drag her out of your lobby." She looked back at him, and her eyes were very calm. She came because she can't bear knowing her child is lying beneath an iron stake with a number on it. That is all. There is nothing else behind it. Do you understand the difference? Gus didn't answer. He opened his mouth, and then he realized that whatever he was about to say would be something he said for his own benefit, so he closed it again. The silence lasted long enough to become an answer. Audie nodded, a very small nod, the kind a person gave after confirming a diagnosis they had already known. "Not yet, then," she said. She pointed to the plastic chair beside the stack of blankets. "Sit down." The fire escape stairwell at Votava Freight was the only place in the entire building without cameras, and Sloane Hartigan knew that because she had personally approved the installation plans years ago. She stood on the landing between the 10th and 11th floors, where the noise of the ventilation system was loud enough to swallow a human voice, and dialed a number she had never saved in her contacts. It rang twice. "What is it?" "A problem I thought had been dealt with a long time ago." The person on the other end said nothing. She heard the swivel of a chair, then the sound of a door closing. "Caspian." "That test mustn't confirm anything, Sloane." His voice changed. "The sample is with the Department of Public Health. It is a state record. Do you understand what I'm telling you? It isn't a test tube sitting in my refrigerator. There won't be a court order. It will go through your facility. That makes it worse. Do you remember who sat with you and those men in gray suits last spring?" Silence. It lasted long enough for her to hear him breathing. "I'll ask again," she said, and she didn't raise her voice. She had never needed to raise her voice in her life. "Do you understand me?" "I understand." She was about to end the call. Her finger was already on the screen. "Sloane." He spoke quickly as though he had just remembered something. "What is her name?" "Sullivan." The other end went silent, not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone who had missed the final step on a staircase and was waiting for the ground to strike them. It lasted far longer than normal. "Caspian? Maeve Sullivan?" She didn't answer. "Sloane, do you remember what happened at St. Bridget Hospital?" And in that empty stairwell, beneath the green emergency light, a woman who had spent nearly 20 years making sure she was never surprised in front of anyone, not even herself, stood perfectly still for a moment. She had never connected the two names. She had never needed to. 4 years earlier, there had been a technician in a laboratory preparing to file a complaint, and Sloane had handled the matter the way she handled everything, neatly, cleanly, without leaving a mark, and she couldn't even remember whether she had ever looked at the woman's face. That person had been a name on a piece of paper that needed to disappear, and during the 4 years that followed, letters had arrived at this building signed M. Sullivan, and Sloane had accepted them, had ordered them forwarded to the 11th floor, and had never opened a single one, because anything mentioning children was blocked under a standing policy she had established long ago and no longer needed to remember. Those two names had existed 3 floors and 4 years apart, and they had never touched, because for them to touch, she would have had to look at someone as a human being with a name of her own, and Sloane didn't do that with the people beneath her. They were categories of problems, not individuals. Then, she drew in a breath and her voice returned to normal, completely normal, so normal that Caspian shuddered on the other end of the line. "Then we have already done this once before," she said. "This time will be easier." She ended the call. For 4 years, she had needed only to do nothing. That was the part people would later find hardest to believe, when everything was laid out on a screen before men with long memories. She had never needed to falsify anything. A woman without an address couldn't receive a reply. A person whose certification had been revoked wouldn't be believed, even when she was telling the truth, especially when she was telling the truth. A person without money couldn't hire a lawyer, and a person who couldn't hire a lawyer couldn't sue anyone. And without a lawsuit, no court would ever hear that name. Silence had done all the work for her. Silence was free, left no fingerprints, and no one had ever been prosecuted for it. Then a dying midwife decided to clear her conscience with Sloane's life. At that same hour, nearly 10 blocks southwest, Maeve sat on the edge of a lower bunk at Mercy Row with the blue-covered notebook open across her knees. She wasn't writing a diary, she was recording the day. Who had said what, at what time? Who had stood where in the lobby, and who had stood where in the conference room? Who had opened the bottle of water, and who hadn't? The name of the woman in the gray sweater, and what she had written in the margins of her pages. The hand that had risen to the strand of pearls and fallen again after 1 second. Audie passed carrying a stack of towels. She stopped. "You're still doing that," she said. "Yes, it cost you everything once." Maeve didn't look up. The tip of her pen kept moving. "Yes." Audie stood there for one more beat. Then she set the stack of towels down, reached across, and pushed the desk lamp closer to Maeve, turning the shade until the light fell directly across the page. And then she continued on. The next morning, he went down to the security room in the basement and told Dov Kessler to pull every piece of lobby camera footage from the archives. 3 years, all of it. He didn't say what he was looking for. Dov didn't ask. The man had gripped a woman's wrists in his lobby less than 2 days earlier. Now he sat beside him in the dark with a remote control in his hand, and some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. He found her 3 times. The first was in the autumn of the year the little girl was born. She stood at the reception desk with a small baby in her arms, the child wrapped in a blanket far too large for her, and she said something to the receptionist, then said it again, then waited. She waited so long that the shift changed, and another young woman took the chair, and Maeve began again from the beginning with someone new. The recording had no sound. He would never know what she had said. But somewhere in the 40-something second of that footage, the baby in her arms lifted her face and followed the brass chandelier hanging in the center of the lobby, and she kept staring at it, her tiny head tipped backward, while her mother spoke to a woman who was shaking her head. Then she left. The second time was 2 winters later. She came alone. She was thinner. It was still the same army coat, but now it hung loose across her shoulders. She opened her mouth to speak to the person behind the desk, and before she could finish the sentence, 2 uniformed police officers entered the frame from the left. And this was what made Gus stop the footage and sit perfectly still. She didn't argue. She didn't wait for them to touch her. She saw them, one small nod to the person behind the desk, and walked toward the door on her own before the first hand could reach for her. She had learned that somewhere between the first visit and the second, no one had taught her. The third time was the previous winter. She didn't go inside. She sat on the steps outside with her back to the glass doors and both hands buried in her pockets. Snow was falling. She remained there long enough for it to gather in a white line along the brim of her hat. Then she stood, brushed off her shoulders, and walked toward the bus stop. Gus rewound the first recording. He played it slowly. The baby was staring at the chandelier, and in the right corner of the frame, there he was. He was walking from the elevator toward the entrance, a phone pressed to his ear, one hand in his trouser pocket, and he passed within a few steps of where they stood. He didn't turn his head. He watched it again. Then he watched it again. Then he watched it again. He watched so many times that he lost all sense of time, until Dov had to stand, leave to get water, and return, and Gus was still watching, and every single time, without exception, he waited for the version of himself on the screen to turn around. It never did. Then he enlarged the image. Then he enlarged it again. Behind him, stepping into the same elevator he had just left, was Sloane Hartigan. He replayed it. She didn't look at the woman. He replayed it again, more slowly, 1 frame at a time. She didn't look at the baby. She looked at the 2 security guards approaching the desk, and when she saw that they were doing their jobs correctly, she turned away and the elevator doors closed. 4 seconds. That wasn't the face of someone hiding something. There was no tension in it, not a single trace of a person who had just seen something she feared. It was the face of someone confirming that the garbage had been taken out. "Boss," Dov said from behind him. Gus didn't turn around. She didn't even look at the little girl, Dov. And somehow that was worse than everything else. If she had looked, if she had stopped, if there had been even 1 second on that face when one human being recognized another, then he would still have had something to be angry at. But she had only checked that the procedure was being carried out correctly. And it was. So she went up to the 11th floor and began her morning. He sat in the darkness for a very long time with the image frozen on the screen. Dove, yes, boss, she came 3 times. 3 times we threw her out, he still didn't turn around. Who signed that order? Dov Kessler remained silent for a long time. He had prepared himself for a question about the day before yesterday, about his own 2 hands, and he had been ready to answer it. He wasn't ready for this one. No one signed anything, boss, he said at last. It was something we knew without anyone needing to sign it. Audie set one condition, and there was only one. If you do it in your building, the girl becomes a beggar in your lobby all over again. So they did it at Mercy Row. In the small room behind the kitchen with a folding table and 3 plastic chairs, and Caspian Voss arrived carrying an aluminum case, accompanied by a young technician in a lab coat embroidered with the company logo. Audie knelt beside her bed, reached underneath it, and pulled out a tin cookie box whose painted colors had long since worn away. She opened the lid. From inside, she took a stiff paper card about the size of a postcard, with 4 small circles soaked through with blood that had dried and turned brown over time, and along the margin was her firm, slanted handwriting. Baby girl Sullivan. Mother healthy. Caspian looked at the box. You kept this under your bed? Where do you keep your valuables, sweetheart? In a safe, then you have a safe. She closed the lid. She did it with one neat, decisive motion before anyone in the room had time to look inside and see what else might be there. Maeve noticed. She opened the blue-covered notebook and wrote it down. Then she stood and began doing the work no one had paid her to do for the past 4 years. She asked the technician's name. She asked for her certification number, waited until the young woman read it aloud, then wrote it down. She took the phone with the cracked screen from her pocket and photographed every evidence seal, the front and the back, and the label on the aluminum case as well. She watched Caspian write the identification code on the tube containing Gus's cheek sample, and she copied it into her notebook, the number 1, the number 2, the 3 letters in front, then read it back once to make certain. MG-0447. He needs to sign across the seal, she said. So do I. That isn't required for a civil test, Caspian said. He didn't look up. It is required. If this result ever becomes part of an exhumation hearing, the first thing the other side will ask is who touched this bag between here and the laboratory, and without signatures across the seal. The answer is, Miss Sullivan. Sloane was sitting in the corner of the room, and she didn't look up from her phone. Are you advising us on laboratory procedure? Under what certification exactly? The room froze. The technician lowered her eyes to the case. Caspian continued writing as though he hadn't heard anything. Gus opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because for 1 second he too had remembered what everyone else in the room had remembered at the same time. Maeve sat down. No one defended her, not because they were cruel. Not one person in that room was cruel, and that was precisely the point. It was only that, in that moment everyone, including the man whose own cheek sample was being taken away for testing, had suddenly remembered that she had nothing left to stand on. No degree, no license. Not one piece of paper anywhere in the world that gave her permission to say what she had just said. So she did the only thing still available to her. She opened her notebook and wrote down the number. When everything was finished, Caspian packed the case again, thanked Audie in a voice far too cheerful for the room, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He turned his head and looked at Gus. 1 second. Only 1 second, but it lasted longer than a glance and less than a question. And there was something on his face that no one in the room could read. No one noticed. Maeve did. She bent over her notebook and wrote 4 characters and a dash. CV watched AV 1 second. She didn't know what it meant. She wrote it because she wrote everything. That afternoon, at Meridian Genomics, the storage room camera lost its signal. It remained dark for 17 minutes. A maintenance request had been entered into the system 2 minutes earlier, reporting a network switch failure, submitted through Caspian Voss's own administrator account. On his way into storage, he heard glass break in the hallway behind him. He didn't turn around. In a building filled with test tubes, someone was always dropping something. He closed the storage room door, stood in the darkness for a moment while his eyes adjusted, then placed the sealed bag on the steel table. He took out a utility knife. His hand was trembling. He had to put the knife down, wipe his palm against his lab coat, then pick it up again. By the time he stepped out of that room, the camera had already been working again for 3 minutes, and the bag resting on the steel table looked exactly as it had when it entered, sealed, signed, and dated. He stood in the hallway with his back against the wall and breathed. He didn't look at the bag. It had taken less time than brewing a pot of coffee. It would cost him the rest of his life. The results arrived on Friday afternoon in an encrypted file sent directly to his inbox, and it was only 3 lines long. The tested man was excluded as the biological father of the comparison sample. Probability of paternity: none. He read it and felt something that terrified him: relief. For 3 seconds before the pain had time to reach him, there were 3 seconds when his entire body grew light, so light that his shoulders dropped, and he released a breath he hadn't known he had been holding for 4 days. Because if the little girl wasn't his, then he hadn't walked past her in that lobby, with a phone pressed to his ear. Then those letters hadn't been meant for him. Then the numbered iron stake in Section 14 belonged to some other man, in some other city, and he could pay the medical bills of a dying midwife, move on, and sleep at night. He believed the paper not because it was convincing. He believed it because it acquitted him, and a man who had spent 20 years making his living by reading other people's motives, a man who had sat across from the finest liars in 3 states and known the exact second each one began, couldn't read his own motive that night. Petra saw it immediately. She was standing beside the window with the report in her hands, and she drew the printed page toward herself, using only her fingertips. The sample code on this report doesn't match the code you signed. Gus didn't hear her. Mr. Votava, she waited. MG0447. That is the number you wrote with your own hand in your notebook at Mercy Row. This report says MG0491, internal accession code. Sloan said from the chair opposite him. Every laboratory assigns a new code when a sample enters its system. Petra, don't let technical language hide what is obvious. I want the complete chain of custody record. Every part of it. From the folding table at Mercy Row to the analyzer. You want many things, Petra. Yes, Petra didn't look up. That is my job. The phone on the desk rang. Then the second one rang. Then Sloan's. The corporation's communications director spoke through the speakerphone in the voice of someone who had just run down 2 hallways. A blog had just published an article. The headline read, "The Ghost Mother. How a Homeless Woman Nearly Got the Chicago Shipping King's Signature." The article included a blurred photograph of Maeve in the lobby, taken from above, and it named the hospital, and it contained details from a child's records that no one outside the 4 people in that room was supposed to know. Gus looked up at the clock. The result had existed for less than half an hour. "Who gave it to them?" he asked. "This is exactly what I was trying to protect you from," Sloan said. "They had this story prepared from the beginning. Pressure you in public before you had time to think. The article says the result was negative." Petra set the report down. "Who outside this room knew?" Sloan turned her head. "Are you accusing me?" "I am asking a compliance question." Gus struck his palm against the table, one short, dry sound, and both women fell silent. He picked up the page, folded it in half, and walked out. He drove southwest and parked outside Mercy Row, and he sat in the car with the paper on his lap without getting out. The lights inside the shelter were still on. Shadows moved back and forth behind the curtains. Beyond the windshield, an ice cream truck rolled slowly through the neighborhood, this late at night, in March, without a single child outside, and it was still playing its chiming song, the same repeating 8-note melody that every city in the world seemed to know. He listened until the song ended. He didn't understand why he hadn't started the engine. He sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, listening as the ice cream truck faded toward the end of the street, and he didn't understand why his chest felt so heavy. Then he remembered. She loved the music from ice cream trucks. He shattered the windshield with his fist. It had been 6 years since he had used his hands that way. For 6 years, he had solved everything through contracts, through signatures, through knowing exactly who owed what to whom and since when. Violence to him wasn't strength. It was evidence of a failed system of governance, the thing that happened when a man had no other way left to say what he meant. That night, the system failed, and the only thing within reach was himself. Shards of glass fell across the dashboard. Blood ran down his wrist and soaked into the cuff of his white shirt. He didn't bandage it. He sat there and let it bleed, and then he did the worst thing a man in his position could do. He turned pain into anger. Because pain had nowhere to go. Anger had an address, and it was 11 steps away, behind that door, Inside, Audie sat in the armchair beside the window with an oxygen tube looped over both ears. And Reeve Mastrantonio was packing his briefcase at the far end of the room. Maeve sat on the edge of the bottom bunk beside an elderly man, reading a trifold instruction sheet aloud to him and pointing to each line with the tip of her pen. She looked up when the door opened. Gus crossed the room and placed the folded paper on the card table. "You are not the mother of my child," he said. "I do not have a child." Maeve read his face before she read the paper. She looked at him for about 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, she already knew everything written on that page. Then she lowered her eyes and read it, all 3 lines, from beginning to end, slowly. "Miss Audie did not lie," she said. "I did not lie. Science says otherwise. Science does not collect samples, sir. People do." The sentence angered him in a way he had not expected, and it angered him precisely because it was true, because it sounded too much like something he himself would have said in any other room, about any other matter. It sounded too much like hope wearing the mask of reason. It sounded too much like someone refusing to let go of something that every educated person in the city had just confirmed did not exist. And he was carrying something inside him that needed somewhere to go. "You waited until the little girl was gone before you came," he said. "You understand me. A living child needs money every month for 18 years. A dead child only requires one payment." The room went still. The elderly man beside Maeve slowly folded the instruction sheet and lowered his eyes to his knees. At the far end of the room, Reeves stopped with one hand resting on the clasp of his briefcase. Audie reached up to remove the oxygen mask from her face. It took her 2 attempts. When she spoke, her voice sounded like crumpled paper. "Get out of my house." Maeve did not raise her voice. She set the instruction sheet down, apologized to the man beside her with a small nod, and stood. When she spoke so quietly that he had to become completely still to hear her. And that was exactly what drove the words into his bones. "Mr. Votava, I sat outside a closed door long enough to memorize every tile on the floor of that hallway. I was not allowed inside. There was a notice taped to the wall explaining why." She let the sentence remain between them for a beat. "You just said I tried to sell that." Then she looked down at his hand. The blood had dried into a dark line running from his knuckles to his wrist, and the cuff of his white shirt had stiffened with it. She did not ask. She said nothing at all. She reached for the plastic first aid box on the shelf, the one the shelter kept there for people who arrived with wounds no one asked them to explain, and pushed it across the table toward him. Not one word. Then she took the blue-covered notebook from her coat pocket. She did not offer it to him like someone begging. She handed it over like someone returning a key. "The number you signed in front of me is written in here," she said. "Your report shows a different number. I am not asking you to believe me. I wrote it down so that later, when you discover the truth for yourself, you cannot say no one warned you." She placed the notebook on the table beside his 3-line report. Then she looked down at the place where she had been sitting. The elderly man's plastic cup had tipped over when she stood, and a small puddle of water was spreading across the seat. She took a paper napkin from her coat pocket and wiped it, carefully, until it was completely dry, out of habit, because she always cleaned the place where she sat. Because, during the past 2.5 years, she had learned that people allowed someone to remain longer when that person left no trace behind. Then she threw the napkin into the trash and walked toward the door. Reeve Mastrantonio stood there with his briefcase in his hand. He did not block Gus's path. He simply stood there. "You could have sent that message through your lawyer tomorrow morning," he said. "I prefer clarity," Gus said. Reeve looked at him and there was no contempt in his eyes, only the exhaustion of a man who had sat beside too many beds and heard that sentence too many times from too many men. "No, sir," he said. "You prefer punishment, and you call it clarity." She walked. Not because she didn't have bus fare that night, but because she needed the cold, needed something outside herself to fight against. Snow had begun falling again that afternoon, the wet kind of March snow that melted the moment it touched the ground, and she walked along the street with both hands buried in the pockets of her army coat. And the memory came without invitation, the way it always did, never at a time when she was prepared for it. She didn't remember when the door had closed. She remembered the sound it made, a very small sound, almost polite, the sound of a door designed not to disturb anyone. And after that, the hallway. She stood up, then she sat down, then she stood again. She did that many times, and she didn't know what she was doing. Her body simply kept doing it on its own, standing and sitting on a plastic chair connected to two other plastic chairs in a row bolted to the floor. There was a notice taped to the wall across from her. She read it, then she read it again. Then she read it once more. Restricted area. Registered family members only. She read it enough times for the words to begin separating from their meaning. Enough times to notice that the period after the word registered was slightly smudged. Enough times to understand that the notice itself wasn't cruel, that no one had taped it there to hurt her. It was only a piece of paper stating something that was true. She was the mother. She was the only person in the world who was the mother, and she didn't have what was required to be registered. Then she began counting the floor tiles. She counted the entire first row, from the base of one wall to the base of the other. Then she counted the second row, then the third. She didn't remember how far she got. She remembered needing something for her mind to do, anything at all, something with a beginning and an ending and a number at the end, because if her mind went empty, it would run toward that door, and she couldn't allow it to run there. So she counted. A nurse walked past. She came from the far end of the hallway carrying a clipboard, and she glanced at Maeve as she passed. The kind of glance people gave those sitting in hospital corridors at 3 o'clock in the morning. Then she took 3 more steps. Then she stopped. She turned around. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask whether Maeve was all right. Didn't ask whether she needed someone called. Didn't say any of the things people were trained to say. She placed the clipboard on the chair beside her, sat next to Maeve on the row of plastic seats bolted to the floor, and stayed there. That was all. She sat there. Later, Maeve tried to remember her face. She tried many times, through many nights, lying on a mattress in a room with 19 beds. She couldn't remember. She couldn't remember the color of the woman's hair, whether she was tall or short, old or young, or what name had been written on her badge. She only remembered that her fingernails were painted yellow. Yellow. The color the little girl had said was too loud, and Maeve, sitting there in that hallway, had thought something completely irrational. Something she would never tell anyone, because it couldn't be explained to anyone who had never been the mother of a child who hated yellow. She had thought that Junie wouldn't like this. Afterward, they let her stay. Long enough. No one made her leave. No one came over with another clipboard and spoke about paperwork, insurance, visiting hours, or restricted areas. Someone had made a decision somewhere, and no one told her who, and she was allowed to stay long enough. It was the only kindness she received in that entire year. The entire year. It came from someone whose name she couldn't remember, whose face she couldn't remember, and whom she never had the chance to thank. And 18 months later, a man wearing a coat worth more than any room she had ever rented would stand across a folding table from her, look directly into her eyes, and tell her she had tried to sell that story in installments. Maeve stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Snow fell across her shoulders and her hat melted, then gathered again. A car passed and splashed water over the hems of her trousers, and she didn't move. She didn't cry, not yet. She took the blue-covered notebook from the inside pocket of her coat, opened it beneath the streetlight, and wrote down the date. 2 blocks from Mercy Row. A laundromat was still lit, its cold white light spilling onto the sidewalk through glass clouded with steam. She walked past it, then stopped, turned around, and pushed open the door. Not to do laundry. There was no one inside except for a dryer running in the far corner. Someone had put money into it and left, and it kept turning, steady and low, a humming noise that filled the room until there was no space left for any other sound. She sat on the row of connected plastic chairs along the wall. She took out the phone with the cracked screen, opened the clock application, set a timer and pressed start. Then she allowed herself to cry. She had learned this during the first weeks after Junie died, in a public restroom at the Halstead bus station. She had discovered that if she didn't set a timer first, she wouldn't be able to stand again. She would sit there until someone knocked on the door. Then she would keep sitting, and the following day would never happen. So she set a timer. Grief, like everything else in her life since then, had to fit within a budget. It was given an allowance, and that allowance was very small, and it wasn't permitted to borrow more. The alarm sounded. The dryer kept turning. She stood, wiped her face with the sleeve of her army coat, drew one breath through her nose, and pushed the door open into the snow. She had never asked for more. Late that night, after the lights beside most of the beds at Mercy Row had gone dark, 2 men came inside. They carried nothing in their hands. They didn't raise their voices. They wore dark coats and stood at a polite distance, and one of them even wiped his feet on the mat by the door. Audie sat in the darkness in her armchair, and they didn't look at her. They walked directly toward Maeve. The taller man placed an envelope on the folding table. He didn't push it. He simply set it down. Inside was cash and a bus ticket to Tulsa, departing before dawn. "Mrs. Hartigan says you're an intelligent woman," he said. His voice was ordinary, almost friendly, the voice of someone explaining how to complete a form. Intelligent people know when a number is a question and when it is an answer. Maeve looked at the envelope for a long time. She looked at it long enough for the second man to shift his weight onto his other foot. She knew exactly how much was inside. Not in dollars. No one in that shelter thought in dollars anymore. She measured it in winters, in mornings waking inside a room, with a door that locked from within, in the number of times she wouldn't have to choose between eating dinner and charging her phone. She looked at that envelope and saw an entire different life folded neatly on the folding table, and she understood exactly what it was worth, and that was what gave meaning to what she did next. She reached out with 2 fingers and pushed it back. "Tell her I know how much is in there," she said. "I know exactly. I counted it in nights. That is why I won't take it." The taller man picked up the envelope. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten her. In his line of work, arguing was the sign of a beginner. He only nodded once and walked toward the door. The second man followed, then turned back at the threshold. He looked at her, and there was something on his face he hadn't intended to reveal. "Do you have a child?" he asked. "I once did," Maeve said. He fell silent. He stood there 1 beat longer than necessary, his hand still resting on the doorknob. Then he left. The door closed very softly behind him, as though he were afraid of waking someone. The next morning, when gray light began creeping through the window, and Maeve was folding blankets at the end of the row of beds, Audie called her over. She didn't ask whether Maeve was afraid. She didn't ask whether she had reconsidered. She only looked at her for a while, then said the thing Maeve would remember long after Audie was gone. "Sweetheart, they weren't threatening you." She pulled the blanket higher over her lap. "They were putting a price on you. That is worse." The legal aid office was on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator, and Toby Rangel took the case not because she cried. He took it because she didn't. "How long did it take you to get here?" he asked as she sat down with the garbage bag beside the leg of her chair. "Several buses. Why didn't you call?" "Because I had nothing to fall back on if you didn't answer." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled a sheet of paper toward himself and began writing. Within 2 days he obtained a preservation order prohibiting Meridian Genomics from deleting or altering camera footage, access logs, chain of custody records, and payment documents. Maeve filed a complaint of her own, and she didn't accuse anyone of switching the samples. She simply listed the errors she had witnessed with her own eyes, numbering each one item per line, in the language of someone who had once written incident reports for a laboratory. Caspian responded within 3 days. The discrepancy between the codes, he wrote, reflected routine internal accession procedures, and he attached a conversion form bearing his own initials and a recorded time. Maeve read the time. Then she sat perfectly still. Then she opened the photo library on her cracked phone and scrolled back to that day. The final photograph she had taken at Mercy Row showed the sealed bag lying on the folding table, its seal intact and unopened, beside the closed aluminum case. She touched the information icon. Date. Time. It was later than the time recorded on Caspian's form. She printed both pages at a copy shop and carried them up to the 3rd floor. Toby placed them side by side on the desk. He looked at one. Then the other. Then the first one again. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "do you understand what you have just given me?" "Yes. I gave you a photograph. You gave me a lie with a timestamp." Then he stopped. He looked at the phone resting on the desk, its screen cracked like a spiderweb from the upper right corner, its case worn white along all 4 edges. "Miss Sullivan, how old is this phone?" "It is old. Does it have cellular service?" "No," she said it in the flat voice she always used for things like that. "I can't afford a plan. I use the wireless internet at the library and the shelter." Toby sat down. He sat down very slowly. "Do you understand what that means?" She didn't answer. A phone without a network connection doesn't synchronize its clock automatically. It doesn't receive commands from anywhere. That means no one, including you, could reach it remotely and alter a timestamp. It has been running on its own internal clock, Alone, for the past 3 years, he pushed the printed photograph toward her. Miss Sullivan, in this entire case, your poverty has just become irrefutable evidence. Maeve looked at the phone in her hand. For 3 years, it had been the thing that proved she had lost everything. It was the thing people glanced at when she took it out at a counter. That morning, it became the only thing in the room that no one could touch. That evening at Mercy Row, Audie told her to pull out the tin box again. Inside, beside the empty space where the card had once rested, lay a faded hospital ribbon and a piece of paper folded into quarters. Maeve opened it. There were no names, only dates and weights with one word at the end of every line: healthy or transferred. Row after row in that firm, slanted handwriting, stretching across nearly 2 decades, the ink changing color from one section to the next depending on which pen still worked at the time. "Why did you keep this?" Maeve asked. "Because no one else did," Audie said. Maeve sat on the floor of her room for a long time with the paper in her hands. No hospital had preserved those lines. No department, board, or system knew they existed. For nearly 2 decades, a woman with no pension, no insurance, and no name anyone knew had quietly recorded every occasion when the world worked exactly as it should, and Maeve understood where she had learned that habit. It hadn't come from the laboratory. There was one more thing at the bottom of the box: an envelope, stamped, addressed, and never mailed. "What is this, Miss Audie?" "Don't read it," Audie said. "Miss Audie, don't read it, sweetheart. It isn't time yet." Maeve placed it back inside the box and closed the lid. On the 3rd floor, Toby explained why this time would be different. The preservation order has frozen Meridian. That is the only laboratory she can reach. This time there will be 2 laboratories, 2 transportation routes, 2 states, within 48 hours, while her accounts are under scrutiny. "Then what will she do?" Maeve asked. Toby tapped his pen against the desk once. "She will stop attacking you. She will attack him." The second collection took place in Reeve's clinic, and Reeve watched from beginning to end. 2 sets of samples, 2 bags, 2 separate routes out of the city. Gus signed across every seal, and Maeve signed beneath his name, and she photographed each one before it left the table. "Whatever the results say," Gus said as they stood, "I won't behave the way I did last time." Maeve slipped the phone into her pocket. "The paper tests biology, sir. Your behavior is a different examination." Caspian Voss arrived at the 3rd floor office on a Thursday morning with his private attorney beside him, and he hadn't slept. The collar of his shirt was damp. He hadn't come because of his conscience. He had come because the preservation order had locked down everything inside his building, because someone from some agency had begun asking his bank very specific questions, and because the licensing board had sent him a letter he still hadn't dared to open. Every door had closed at once, and he had come here because this was the only one still standing slightly open. Toby didn't begin with the test. He began somewhere else entirely. "How long have you known Mrs. Hartigan? She is related to me on my mother's side." "Where did you work before Meridian?" Caspian fell silent. His attorney touched his arm. Caspian brushed the hand away. "Mr. Voss, St. Bridget Hospital," he said. "I was the director of laboratory quality assurance." The temperature in the room changed. Toby set down his pen. He spoke the next sentence very slowly, one word at a time, as though he needed to hear himself say it before he could believe it. "You were the person who signed the decision to fire Maeve Sullivan." Caspian didn't answer. "Answer me, yes. Why?" He looked down at both hands resting on the table. "Because she told me that if I didn't sign it, I would be the next person investigated." And there, inside a legal aid office, where the air conditioner rattled too loudly, 2 threads that had seemed to have nothing to do with one another, suddenly touched. Sloane Hartigan hadn't destroyed Maeve Sullivan's life 4 years earlier to protect August Votava. She hadn't known who Maeve was. She hadn't known there was a child. She hadn't known that the woman preparing to file a complaint in that basement laboratory had sat in the lobby of her building twice, with a little girl in her arms. It was much simpler than that, and because it was simpler, it was far colder. Maeve had been preparing to report falsified test results in the very laboratory Sloane was using to move money through the organization's medical service contracts. She had only been sealing a hole. She sealed it the way she sealed every hole, and she never looked down to see whether anyone was standing beneath it. 4 years later, that same woman walked into her lobby with a letter inside a plastic bag. "Did you know who Miss Sullivan was?" Toby asked. Caspian laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound with nothing inside it. Knew who she was from the second I walked into that shelter. Everyone in the field knows that name, knows it in what way? In the sense that you don't want to become her. He raised his head. They use her name to frighten new employees. You see something wrong there? You're thinking of filing a complaint? You want to become Sullivan? Silence. No one in the room spoke for a long while. I switched the sample because I knew no one would believe her, Caspian said. She had already been burned. All I had to do was not put out the fire. Toby picked up his pen again. What sample were you planning to use? One I took from storage. Anonymous, no identifying record, something that had been sitting there for a long time. I had it in the pocket of my lab coat that morning. What happened? Caspian looked down at his hands once more. This time he looked longer. The camera went dark, he said. I had 17 minutes. I went into storage, locked the door, and opened the sealed bag. Then I reached into the pocket of my lab coat. He stopped. The tube wasn't there. Where was it? I dropped it in the hallway. His voice was perfectly ordinary, and that was the worst part. I heard glass break while I was walking into storage, right behind me. I didn't turn around because in a building filled with test tubes, someone is always dropping something. I thought it was someone else. He drew in a breath. It was me. Then what did you do? Caspian didn't answer. Mr. Voss, I had 11 minutes, he said. I had a swab. And I had my own mouth. 4 days. That was all it existed for. 4 days in which a man read 3 lines and felt his whole body grow light. 4 days in which a piece of paper traveled across the city and turned a mother into a joke on a blog. 4 days that ended with a sentence August Votava would carry until the day he died. A sentence thrown into the face of a woman who had sat outside a closed door, long enough to memorize every tile beneath her feet. And all of it had begun with the sound of glass breaking on a hallway floor, a sound no one had cared enough to turn around and investigate. Petra Nowak entered his office that afternoon carrying a document case, and she didn't knock. She placed 4 things on his desk, one beside the other, and said nothing until he had looked at all 4. The first was an extract of the metadata from the attachment in the anonymous email sent to the blog. In the device information field was a computer name, and that name belonged to Sloane Hartigan's second laptop, the one she used when traveling, the one the technology department had issued to her 3 years earlier, and no one had ever taken back. The second was the building's endpoint log, printed raw and unedited. It showed that the file had been exported from that computer, and it showed the time. That time came before the moment he opened the official report in his own inbox. Not by much, only a few minutes. But a few minutes was a distance that couldn't be explained by anything except someone having received it before he did. The third was the corporation's list of approved vendors, and Meridian Genomics wasn't on it. It never had been. The expense had been classified under a budget code called Reputation Management, a code Sloane herself had created years earlier, and that only she had the authority to approve. The fourth was a bank statement, not a corporate statement. The payment appeared in none of the company's books. It had gone from her personal account to a consulting company, registered under the name of someone no one in that room had ever heard of. Gus looked at the final page for a long time. How long have you had this? Since the day you read the report, Petra said. Why didn't you tell me? She gathered the 4 pages into a straight stack, tapped their edges against the desk twice to align them, then placed them inside her case and locked it. Because you didn't ask that day, she said. You only wanted it to be true. She walked out. She didn't slam the door. She had never slammed anything in her life. That evening, Dov Kessler knocked and entered alone, and he closed the door behind him, which was something Dov never did. He stood in the center of the room with his arms hanging at his sides. Boss. Voss is at the Drake Hotel. He spoke in the voice of someone reporting the weather. Room 1140, alone. No one else is on that floor except him in 2 empty rooms. Tomorrow morning, he enters witness protection. After that, we lose him forever. Gus remained silent for a long time. Beyond the window, the city was doing what cities always did at that hour, and somewhere below was a hotel room with a man inside who couldn't sleep. What are you asking me, Dov? I'm asking whether you want me to ask, and that was the real temptation. Not the kind from movies, with someone holding out a gun or making an offer. Only a question asked in an ordinary voice by a loyal man, in a warm room, on a March evening, one night. Only one night, and the man who had sat in the darkness with a swab in 11 minutes would never sit anywhere again, and with him would disappear the sworn statement, and with that statement, would disappear the passage, describing a 34-year-old man standing beside a folding table, saying the worst thing he had ever said in his life, and walking away. The whole city would never know what August Votava had believed for 4 days. If I do that, Gus said, I've just proven her right, boss. Let him testify. He didn't raise his voice. I need documents. I don't need a body. Dov didn't move. He had worked for this man for 9 years, and he had never heard anything like the sentence that had just been spoken, and he didn't know what to do with it. Gus stood and walked to the window. Dov. For 20 years, I've been able to reach anyone in this city. Anyone. You understand me. That isn't an empty boast. Anyone. He looked down at the line of red lights crawling along the avenue. But in all those 10 years, there was exactly one thing I couldn't do. Speak to my daughter. He didn't turn around. You tell me what power is. Dov Kessler didn't answer. He stood there in the middle of the room with the same 2 hands that, not long ago, had gripped a woman's wrists in the lobby below, and he had no answer. The extended family council met in the grand chamber on the 23rd floor, and there wasn't a single journalist in the room, but there was something far more dangerous. Branch leaders, 2 outside attorneys, 2 union partners, and men whose memory stretched so far back that they still remembered exactly what his father had owed and to whom. Sloane struck first. She presented a packet of documents showing that organizational funds had been diverted to cover a personal medical expense, and she presented it in the voice of someone doing something she didn't want to do. For nearly 10 years, I protected this organization, she said. Then a woman carrying a garbage bag walked into our lobby with a manufactured story and a dead child, the most convenient thing in the world, because no one can question the dead. Poor people don't knock on doors anymore. They arrive with medical records and force money to its knees. Then Petra Nowak stood and made her presentation, and she didn't offer a single word of commentary. First, the real bank statements. Every payment had come from August Votava's personal account, and not 1 cent had been taken from organizational funds. Second, the metadata from the document Sloane had just presented, created before dawn on Tuesday on Sloane Hartigan's second laptop. Third, the export log for the negative result, generated from that same computer before Gus had opened the report in his own inbox. Fourth, the sample codes. MG0447 was the number both parties had signed across on the seal. MG0491 was the number entered into the analyzer, and the source of MG0491 had now been identified. Toby Rangel stood. That means the report wasn't wrong, he said. It was perfectly accurate. It said Caspian Voss wasn't the father of Junie Sullivan, and that was the only true thing on the entire page. The paper hadn't lied. Someone had simply asked it the wrong question. Fifth, the storage room camera log. A 17-minute loss of signal, disabled through Voss's own administrator account, accompanied by his sworn statement. Sixth, 2 independent results, from 2 laboratories in 2 different states, sent through 2 separate transportation routes, both reaching the same conclusion. August Votava was the biological father. Probability greater than 99.99%. The pen in Sloane's hand snapped. A piece of plastic fell onto the table, rolled in a short circle, then stopped. No one spoke. Then Petra advanced to the final page, the one she had saved. On the screen appeared a letter exactly 1 sentence long. The little girl is 3 years old. I have no other way left. Beside it was a receipt, and on the receipt was a signature. S. Hartigan. Petra displayed the date it had been received. Then she displayed the date on the gravestone Junie had never had. 66 days. Petra said nothing. She left those 2 numbers on the screen and stepped back. Someone in the room turned away. Branko Ilic, Gus's uncle, who had sat at the same table with his father before Gus had learned to walk, stood when Gus announced that the laboratory fraud records would be turned over to the federal authorities. You are going to open the door and let them into our house over a birth certificate? I am not opening the door, Gus said. I am giving them 1 room, and only 1 room. If I conceal the falsification of medical records, I give them a hook in my chest for the rest of my life. If I hand it over, I give them something that was never mine, and if they pull the thread, then I cut off my own hand before they reach my throat. Sloane didn't collapse. She stood straighter, and that was more frightening than anything else. Yes, I did what had to be done. That child would have become heir to this organization. Do you know what happens when people smell blood? I was closing the wound, Maeve stood. Toby touched her arm. She walked to the front of the room. Sloane looked her over from head to toe. Don't imagine that one report makes you my equal. You don't remember me, do you? Maeve said. I don't understand what you are. 4 years ago, you took my profession from me. You didn't look at my face when you did it. I was a name on a page you needed to make disappear. Then for the next 4 years, you signed for letters from that same name. She placed her hand on the stack of receipts. M. Sullivan. Your signature. 4 years. Sloane looked at the papers. And for the first time in this entire story, her face did something. You didn't hide me from him, Maeve said. You didn't even know who you were hiding. You simply didn't see me. Either time, Sloane didn't answer. She had nothing to say. She turned toward Gus. Tell them who stayed when you had nothing. Gus stood. You stayed. Yes, hope flashed in her eyes, and because you stayed, I trusted you beyond reason. That was my failure. He turned toward the room. Sloane manipulated evidence, but I was the one who made the choices. I chose not to read those letters because I paid someone else to read them for me. I chose a convenient laboratory because I feared scandal more than I feared the truth. He stopped. No. Let me say that correctly. I chose it because I wanted a negative result, and I got one. No one controlled my mouth when I stood beside the bed of a dying old woman and told the child's mother that she had tried to sell her daughter. I did that, alone. At the door, Sloane understood. You are handing me over to them? August, you know I would rather have you end this here, I know. He looked at her one last time. You want an ending that means something. You will get a trial and a stack of records, and afterward, no one will remember your name. That is what I do to the person who erased my daughters. Security moved forward and Dov Kessler was among them. Gus raised one hand. No dragging. No further conversation. Escort her according to procedure. Sloane Hartigan stood exactly where Maeve had once stood, between 2 uniformed men, in a lobby with far too many people watching. Then she walked. Her heels struck the stone floor, hard and solitary, and the sound followed her into the elevator until the doors closed. The meeting broke apart, and the men with long memories began rising from their seats. And in the back row, Adeline Brewer, who had insisted on coming in a wheelchair even after Reeve had told her no twice, folded forward. The oxygen tank fell over. Reeve dropped to his knees beside her at once. Someone in the room raised a phone. Put it down. Gus's voice cut across the room, and it wasn't loud, but all 20 people inside stopped. The phone lowered. No one raised another. For 20 years, whenever August Votava protected something, it meant he was controlling it. That morning, for the first time, protection meant only privacy, meant only that an old woman was allowed to lie on the floor without anyone turning her into a video. Homewood Cemetery. Several days later, early in the morning, Section 14 had no headstones. It had only iron stakes driven into the grass, each one stamped with a number, and the grass had grown over their bases the way grass always grew in places no one visited. They were all there, Maeve, Gus, Toby, Reeve, Audie in her wheelchair with an oxygen tube looped over her ears and a blanket across her knees because she had refused to stay home, and several people from Mercy Row standing in a line behind them. When they reached the edge, Maeve stopped and removed her boots. No one told her to do it. She only looked down at the men's boots, one size too large for her, saw the thick March mud caked across the soles, and took them off before stepping forward barefoot onto the cold earth. She is lying beside 11 strangers, she said. I don't know their names. I think about that every night. My child is lying beside 11 people. I will never be able to thank for staying beside her. Toby held out the documents and Gus signed. That signature had once opened ports. It had opened unions. It had made men across 3 states call and cancel their plans in a single afternoon. That morning, for the first time in its life, it did the only thing worth doing. What do you want engraved? Toby asked. Maeve remained silent for a long time. The wind moved across the open ground, with nothing there to stop it. Her name, she said. The dates. And she loved the music from ice cream trucks. Is that all? People carve grand words onto children's graves to comfort the adults, she said. My child doesn't need to be comforted. She needs to be known. Then Audie called Gus over to her wheelchair. From beneath the blanket, she pulled out a stamped and addressed envelope that had never been mailed. This is the letter I wrote to you after the little girl died, she said. I didn't send it. Why? Because I knew she would read it, and I couldn't bear the thought of these words dying inside a paper shredder. He opened it. 1 page. The handwriting was still steady, written at a time when she had been far stronger than she was now. Mr. Votava, the little girl never asked about you. I want you to know that. Not to hurt you, but because I believe you deserve the truth instead of a more comforting version." She didn't ask because her mother answered before she ever had the chance. Her mother told her that there was a man who didn't know her yet, that it wasn't her fault, and that it might not be his fault either. I stood outside the door that day and heard her. I was so angry I had to go stand in the yard for a while. That woman had nothing, no home, no profession, no one, and she still refused to give her child an enemy. I'm not writing this letter to ask anything of you. The little girl is gone. There is nothing left to ask for. I'm writing because I need someone to know that it happened. I need someone to know that in a place no one ever looked toward, a mother chose not to turn you into a monster, even though doing so would have been much easier. Even if you never read this letter, I will still have written it. Some things need to be recorded even when no one reads them. Oh, Brewer. Gus finished reading. Then he sat down in the wet grass beside the grave, still wearing his suit, both elbows resting on his knees, the page hanging between his hands. Maeve stood several steps away and didn't understand what was happening. She hadn't read the letter. She never would. "What did you tell her about me?" he asked. His voice broke in the middle of the sentence. "I told her you didn't know her yet," Maeve replied calmly. "That was all? That was all. Why?" She looked down at the earth where the headstone would be placed. "Because she only had 4 years," she said. "I wasn't going to use a single minute of them teaching her to hate anyone." The others began walking back toward the cars. Gus remained seated. Reeve came and stood beside him. "Are you all right?" Gus didn't turn. "I just realized I don't even know which way her hair curled." From the wheelchair, Audie's voice carried toward him, thin as paper and clear in every word. "Then don't try to remember, sweetheart," she said. "Learn. Remembering belongs to the people who were there. Learning belongs to those who came late." A few weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, Audie was too weak to push her own wheelchair across the kitchen threshold, and she made Gus cook soup for the entire shelter. He didn't argue. He took off his suit jacket, hung it over the back of a plastic chair, and rolled up his shirt sleeves. And when he did, an old burn scar running from his wrist to his elbow appeared beneath the kitchen lights, and no one in the room asked him about it. He didn't know how to peel potatoes. He held the knife like a weapon and peeled as though the potato owed him money. Audie sat in the kitchen doorway and gave orders like a general commanding from the top of a hill. "You're peeling too thick. Look at what you're throwing away. You just tossed out lunch for 2 people. He looked down at the bowl of peelings. Then he began again, more slowly. When Maeve returned, she stood in the doorway and saw the boss of the Lagerst organization on the Chicago waterfront crying because of the onions, his eyes red, one hand wiping his forehead and smearing onion skin into his hair, while an old woman on oxygen told him he was cutting them in the wrong direction. She said nothing. She hung up her coat and went to get bowls. The entire shelter ate dinner that night, 19 people, not counting the children. Not one of them knew who he was. A little boy sitting across from him finished his bowl, then rested his chin in his hands and watched him for a while. "What do you do for work?" the boy asked. Gus was silent for a long time. His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "I'm learning," he said. Later, after everyone had gone to sleep, Audie pulled Maeve close and spoke very softly. "He can't repair what has already happened, sweetheart. No one can repair what has already happened." She looked toward the sink, where he was scrubbing a pot he didn't know how to scrub. "But he can peel potatoes. People begin there. From then on, he came every Thursday. He read the blue-covered notebook a little at a time each week. Never quickly, never more than a few pages at once, while Maeve sat in the chair beside him with her own work and explained nothing. She didn't warn him which pages would be difficult. She allowed him to walk into them alone. One evening, he stopped for a long time at one page. "Can't brush her hair. She has 2 cowlicks. I fight with the comb every morning, and the comb always loses. She says her hair doesn't listen to anyone." He read that passage 3 times. Then he turned to the next page. Every night, the same thing. She lies down, then bolts upright again. "Mama, I forgot to say goodnight to Miss Audie. Then I have to carry her 4 steps across the hallway so she can say goodnight. 4 steps. Every night. For 4 years. Gus set the notebook down on the table. He stood and walked outside, and he remained in the concrete yard behind the shelter beneath the April sky, and he didn't come back inside for a very long time. Maeve didn't follow him. She stayed inside with the notebook open on the table, and left him out there for as long as he needed. Audie died before dawn near the end of May. in the same room she had managed for nearly 20 years, with Maeve holding her hand. There were no grand final words. She said nothing about the little girl, nothing about the letter, nothing about August Votava or what she had done for the mother and child. She opened her eyes once, looked up at the ceiling, and spoke the final sentence of her life. "Remember to replace the battery in the smoke detector in room 3. Then she closed her eyes. Maeve sat there for a while in the darkness. Then she stood, walked to the supply closet at the end of the hallway, took out a battery, positioned a chair beneath the smoke detector in room 3, removed its yellowed plastic cover, and replaced the battery. She did it before calling the funeral home. She finished the task, pressed the test button, listened to the confirming beep, closed the cover, and returned the chair to its proper place. Then she walked 4 steps across the hallway. 4 steps. She had counted them every night for 4 years with a child in her arms, and she had never counted them wrong. She stood in the doorway of Miss Audie's room and said good night. For the little girl, justice wasn't a gavel. It was 14 months of paperwork refusing to disappear. 14 months in which numbers refused to change their minds and timestamps refused to tell a different story. Sloan Hartigan was convicted. Caspian Voss lost his license and never regained the position he had abused. Dov Kessler wasn't fired because the internal investigation concluded that a culture had been built inside that building, a culture in which people feared punishment for asking questions, and he was assigned to rewrite the lobby rules. Maeve added one line: "A person may be denied entry to the building according to procedure, but they must never be humiliated or touched unless there is an immediate threat to safety." Dov signed his name beneath it. The licensing board took 11 months to return what it had taken away in a single afternoon, and it arrived through the mail in an ordinary envelope, and she read it at the kitchen table, then put it away. One Thursday evening, Maeve pushed the blue-covered notebook across the table toward Gus. "You can open that page now," she said. He opened the page with the folded corner. "Today she asked me what he looks like. I told her I don't have a picture." She thought for a while, then said, "Then I'll draw him. I'll make him look like Mama, and that will be close enough." She drew a man with 2 cowlicks on top of his head, because she said fathers and children are supposed to look alike. I went into the bathroom and turned on the water. He turned to the next page. The drawing was still there, fastened with yellowed tape, done in crayon, a stick figure of a man with 2 small circles on top of his head. "She drew me," he said. "She drew a man with 2 cowlicks. She had never seen you. Then how did she know?" "She didn't," Maeve said. "She only guessed. And she guessed correctly because she believed fathers and children were supposed to look alike." He sat for a very long time with the notebook open across his lap. "That is why I needed your signature," she said. "Not to make you feel better, so that if she had ever guessed correctly, there would finally be one place in this world recording that she had been right." That autumn, they went to the cemetery to leave flowers. The weather was cold. Maeve searched through her coat pocket for the car keys. "Dad, hold this for me." Both of them froze. Gus took the bouquet. His hand trembled not because he was overwhelmed, but because he knew he hadn't yet earned the words she had just spoken. Maeve kept her eyes on the headstone. "I wasn't speaking to you." She looked at the name carved into the stone and the line beneath it. "I'm practicing saying it for her." She never had the chance to say that word. Gus cried for the first time in many years, silently, standing straight without wiping his face. One Monday morning, at the community clinic in Pilsen, there was a small table in the corner with 2 chairs and a locking cabinet. An older woman wearing a coat far too thin for March approached the table, holding an envelope that had been folded until it was nearly torn. "Miss, I don't understand what they wrote. They said it was urgent. I'm too frightened to open it." Maeve stood and pulled out a chair. "Please sit down. I don't have money for a consultation. This table doesn't sell respect." It was a follow-up appointment notice. Not a diagnosis. It only meant that further testing was needed. "So I don't need to go home and start planning my funeral?" "No, Mum. Don't let fear end a story the doctor hasn't finished writing." At the far end of the waiting room, a middle-aged woman stood and walked to the volunteer registration desk. Maeve handed her the form. The woman's fingernails were painted yellow. Maeve looked at that hand. She said nothing. She only offered her a pen. Some debts don't need to be collected. They only need to be acknowledged. Beneath the protective glass on Maeve's desk were 3 things. The 2 halves of Audie's letter joined with archival tape, The tear, still visible, a pink plastic wristband with 2 tooth marks on the inside of the clasp, and a blue-covered notebook whose cover had come loose. At the far end of the room, Gus stood beside Reeve. He had come to deliver the fund's audit report. He didn't intrude on that moment. He didn't tell anyone about his relationship with her. "Do you know why she is so good at this?" Reeve asked. "Why?" "Because she is the person that letter needed to find. The person who reads before judging, who explains before giving orders, who understands that urgency isn't permission to strip anyone of their dignity. The most painful betrayal in this story wasn't the falsified test result. It was the speed with which fear, pride, and status allowed a piece of paper to erase the humanity of people who had already endured far too much. A child doesn't become worthy of a headstone because her father is rich. A woman doesn't lose her right to be heard because she sleeps at a bus station. A test result is only trustworthy when the process protecting it is trustworthy. And an apology only has meaning when changed behavior gives it legs. Junie Sullivan now lies beneath a stone bearing her name, not because her father was rich, but because her mother recorded everything, and because a few decent people dared to say no to a powerful man. Dignity isn't a favor the strong grant to the weak. It belongs to every human being before money, status, illness, or bloodline enters the room. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with you the longest? Who made you think the most after it was over? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear what is deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.